Donald Trump became president in part because of the forces that Charles Murray was putting his finger on and coming apart. You're going to relegate him to the margins because he dared to ask a question about intelligence and class structure in American life, of which only one small part of the big compendium had to do with race, and now he's a racist and he's a white supremacist. You know nothing anti-intellectual thugs. I mean, the people who want to shut up a discussion about this question and who want to make it a sign of your decency and your legitimacy for membership in society to castigate and ostracize Charles Murray, which I am not going to do. Those people are a threat to civilization, in my opinion.
Yeah, although there is one aspect of this which I'm a little conflicted about, because I don't know where to draw the line here.
Hello out there. This is Glenn Loury, The Glenn Show at substack.com/Glenn Show. And at YouTube, I'm with Sam Harris, noted author, neuroscientist, and philosopher, a podcast behemoth with what are you calling Sam?
The podcast is
Up?
Making Sense, yeah. The
or Making
meditation app
Sense.
is Waking Up. Yeah.
Making Sense with Sam Harris. Author of many books. I've got a list here: Free Will, Lying, The Moral Landscape, The End of Faith, Letters to a Christian Nation. So, I mean, you've got quite a resume there, Sam. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I've spoken with you once before for your podcast, if I'm not mistaken. It's been 5 or 6 years.
Happy to do it.
Thanks for doing this.
You are one of my gurus on the topics we touched on my podcast. You have my proxy. I just default to your views on questions of race and moral confusion publicly around issues of race in our society. So thanks for all that you do. It's been great to be a student of yours.
Well, thanks, but you shouldn't default to my view.
As a proxy for actually thinking everything through from first principles. I've now seen enough to know that I probably agree with you on these topics, and you and obviously the rest of the team. I mean, John McWhorter and Coleman and Camille, and there are many people who are having a similar conversation. And not to say that you guys are all in agreement on all the fine points, but it's just I've become a student of all of you. So, yeah.
Thomas Chatterton Williams, would you include him in that bunch? Chloe Valdery. We are all black. These people that you're calling attention.
And I consider it a perversion of our social discourse that is relevant, but unfortunately, it is all too relevant. You know, I mean, it's just you can say things, and you need to say things that I can't easily say, or I will pay a slightly different price, or a drastically different price for saying them. And not to say you don't pay any price. I know you have, but it's the fact that the color of your skin is relevant to the conversation is why the conversation is so necessary, because it really shouldn't be. And if we were in a saner world, you wouldn't feel any special need to touch the issue of race based on your identity. So.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's not over yet. We're fighting for making it a better world, a world more like the one that you envision. We don't live in that world at the present time, I would note. There's a difference to be drawn between the principle it shouldn't matter and the fact it does matter. And in view of the fact that it matters, that has implications, I suppose, for how we conduct ourselves. We avoid certain issues or take certain risks. I mean, I can take risk in my classes, for example, teaching. I can say things that I think if one of my white colleagues were to say them, they might get into trouble. I mean, my friend Amy Wax, the law professor at the University of Pennsylvania, is in trouble now because of some things she said here at the Glenn show, raising questions about immigration or affirmative action policy. And I don't necessarily agree with everything she says, although I do agree with some of the things that she says. But she said things like, if you have lower standards for admitting black kids, then the kids you admit are not going to do on average as well as the kids that you didn't lower the standards to admit.
Yeah, that seems
This is
fairly
just
logical. Yeah.
logic. If the if the standards actually correlate with the performance of the students whom you admit, which if they don't, why would
Right.
you be using them as standards? I'm talking about like admissions tests. And if you use a lower score for admitting some kids than others, then just it's a statistical necessity that on the average, you're going to predict those kids to do less well on the average, not one each one individually. And she says stuff like that, and it's in a her dean has now written a letter to the faculty, bringing her up on charges for engaging in activity in the classroom contrary to the values of the university. And I say this in my classes every day, and no one has come around yet with a hook to pull me off
Yeah,
stage.
I honestly don't know what I believe about affirmative action. I mean, I think, to first approximation, I think uh, at one point it was absolutely necessary, and it was obviously a lever that could be pulled to right a moral wrong and a social ill. But I think now we're at a point where it's creating its own negative effects, such that, I mean, to name only one, it requires obvious racism against Asians at this moment to be enacted. Um, so I don't know what I think. I think it's problematic for a lot of reasons, and some of which you just cited based on what Amy said. Um, I mean, I think the most insidious aspect to it is that I can envision occasions where it would seem to justify something that looks like racism. Even though it would be motivated differently. I'm thinking of a case where, I mean, for instance, if it could be established, I believe it might have been established that um, the medical field, various medical fields have practiced such affirmative action that you could reliably expect that the people in those jobs, the cardiologists or the brain surgeons of color, had less stringent requirements applied to them to get into those positions, right? If that is in fact true, I mean, I know people like Charles Murray have argued that it is true. Um, you get one chance to have brain surgery, on yourself or on your kid, right? And so, how enthusiastic should you be to have a black brain surgeon if you know that the MCATs for black doctors are a standard deviation lower, or whatever it is, right? I mean, I know Charles Murray has delved rather deeply and dangerously into facts of that kind in his latest book. If in fact that were true, and you would expect it to be true if affirmative action really has been widely practiced there, um, that's a really insidious and perverse outcome. The last thing I would want would be to be confronted with the choice between two surgeons uh, for a potentially life-saving and life jeopardizing surgery, and to have my main criteria be in deciding between them the color of their skin. I mean, that's not the world I want to live in, and that's potentially a world we have engineered through good intentions, right? And so that's something that's one example. I mean, there are many examples where the stakes aren't that high and we don't care, and it's in fact rational to care about the social good of diversity, say, but brain surgery is not one of them, right? And um, uh, as is and
It's a
pervert,
powerful example.
the analogously, on the other
It
side of the coin, athletics is not one of them. I don't see anyone arguing that we need more Jews in the 100-meter dash at the Olympics, right? And there are no Jews alleging anti-Semitism for the fact that Jews are not well represented, on the podium at the Olympics.
Yeah, they're going to dismiss this kind of argument. I think there's nothing logically wrong with what you're saying. They're going to say, who plays basketball or who plays soccer is not really important, but who gets to do brain
Mm,
surgery or more generally gets access to the medical profession is important. They're going to claim that there's some studies, they're probably not going to be particularly impressive studies that show that black patients do better when they have black doctors, et cetera. They're gonna deny the relevance of the admission standard that was employed for the medical student to the judgment about the proficiency of the brain surgeon, arguing that there are many, 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 many other filters between medical school admission and actually
mm,
being in the operating theater. Uh, they're going to dare you to do the statistical inference that you're just doing. I mean, gosh, if they're using lower standards to admit blacks, and if my brain surgeon could be white or black, it's my choice. Why would I ever choose a black brain surgeon just based on the statistics? They're going to call that kind of profiling to be a normative fault, like a police officer who
mm.
behaves differently when he stops a car with a young black kid in the vehicle than he does with an older white woman in terms of the kid's reaching for the glove compartment. Do I or do I not take that to be an aggressive act? So
Yeah,
that's what they're
yeah.
going to
Well, I
say.
wish some of that were valid. Um, one thing to point out is that whites are not at the top of the heap there when you're doing this sort of profiling for surgeons. I mean, I think by this logic, you should prefer an Asian surgeon at this point, knowing what they're up against. Oh yeah, yeah,
By
yeah.
a wide margin.
So
If the Asian kid gets into medical school, she
a
must have
superstar,
been
yeah,
literally
yeah.
off the
But
charts.
but this is, I would argue this is not the world we want to live in. But I don't know how to get to the world we want to live in, right? Because
Well, I
uh,
I have an answer to that question. Develop the historically underrepresented group's performance such that it is comparable or at least closer to that which is exhibited by other groups, and accept the reality that not all groups are going to perform every activity at the
mm,
same frequency as they are represented in the population. That's a silly
yeah,
criterion of justice. If you want there to be more black brain surgeons, then let's get more black kids doing biochemistry at a high level when they're juniors or sophomores in college, and which means let's getting more black kids doing high school chemistry and biology in the advanced placement level that some of the other kids are doing it. And accept that if blacks are 12% of the population, it's okay if blacks are 7% of the brain surgeons and 18% of the whatever the flip side is.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Well,
I think that's what you need. I mean, those things are not entirely beyond
if we could get
our
people to swallow
region.
that pill all at once, I think it would be all to the good. I do think that is the framing that is so morally confusing here. The idea that every walk of life that is desirable to be walking in requires um, a representation of the population that is, perfectly in register with the general population, right? So that if you have less than 12 or 13% African Americans in any desirable walk of life, that is a problem, just on its face, and very likely explained by the ambient levels of racism that persist in that walk of life. I think that's, I mean, what the second claim is obviously false, and I think the first claim is also, as you just argued, needs to needs to give because it's just whatever the explanation, whether it's cultural, biological, accidental, it's just not rational to expect that every group will show the precisely the same proclivity and aptitude for everything that is good to be involved in the theater of human events.
Frankly, I think it's a logical contradiction. I mean, I think it's demonstrably wrong. So the identitarians, the people who are talking about how many of this group and that group, they take groupness seriously. They think this thing, race, actually
Mm,
matters for some reason or another. They think ethnicity and ethnic identity, I identify as a this or a that. So if these things are real, these uh, differences between groups are actually constitutive of something meaningful, different, embracing different visions about ways of life, different interests, different practices and patterns, different culture, different beliefs, different expectations, different habits. How can it be but that they would reproduce themselves to some degree in the different allocation of
Mhm.
time, the different investments in the various kinds of development, and so on, which would then be reflected in different occupations and engagement. I wouldn't expect them all to be in the same industries. I wouldn't expect them all to be doing the same thing. Some of them are going to be small shopkeepers more frequently than other groups are going to be. Some of them are going to be academics more frequently than other groups will be. Some of them are going to be athletes and entertainers more frequently than in other groups are going to be because groupness ends up being expressed in
Mhm.
terms of what people do with their time and how they live their lives. So then I think groupness matters. I'm prepared to fall on my sword to make sure that the black kid feels comfortable as a black kid in college. But then I expect that everybody's going to be in medical school, law school, in finance at the same rate as they are in the population.
Yeah.
I just think that's a logical contradiction. You weren't serious about identity if you expected to see a mirrored, proportionate expression of the various members of the identity groups in every
Yeah. Yeah. That's
human
a great point.
endeavor.
If diversity matters because there are actually differences that matter between groups, well, then you'd expect those differences to have
Yeah.
some expression that that leads to different, differences. So you can't really have it both ways there.
Now, you mentioned Charles Murray, and you said whether it's cultural or biological or whatever. And I'm aware of your big debate with Ezra Klein. Was it
Yeah,
some
yeah.
years ago about Murray and all of that stuff? You got it. You taking any of it back, or are you still holding out for whatever
Well,
you were
I
holding out
was
for?
I
Tell
was
me what
not
you were
holding
holding out
out for
for, and tell me whether
any
or not the
uh, positive part of his thesis, apart from the necessity of being able to talk about these things without being branded a racist when it's obvious that you're not a racist. Right? That was
yeah
the hill I was prepared to die on. Right? It's not. I mean, I have the truth is I have as close to zero interest in racial differences in anything as I think you can have. Right? I'm just not interested in the topic. What I am interested in is the silencing effect of the perception that if you um, violate any one of a number of increasing number of taboos uh, erected on the left and by our most prestigious institutions, journalistically and academically, you risk um, defenestration, right? So when Charles Murray stands up, 25 years after he wrote his infamous book, which I hadn't read at the time because had been convinced by all
yeah
the bad PR that this was just racist, uh, uh, you know, moral pollution, essentially. Um, when he stands up 25 years after having written that, having written many other books in the interim on different topics at Middlebury, and
yeah
gets deplatformed semi-violently, such that his host gets a concussion, I
yeah.
think, or a neck injury. Um, yeah,
I think it
I
was a neck
perceive
injury.
a real problem there that I wanted to talk about, and so in the course of talking about it, we spoke about his actual thesis, which again is routinely misrepresented. I mean, when you look at the most controversial paragraph in
Right.
the bell curve, which I then went and read in advance of speaking with him.
I have
Yeah,
read
I
the
mean,
bell
so the
curve cover to
worst
cover.
paragraph in there is a paragraph where he and Herrnstein say we don't know what contribution biology and environment make to these differences. Um, it seems rational to assume that both are involved. I'm paraphrasing here.
They
Yeah,
are
but
resolutely
but
agnostic. Excuse me for
the,
interrupting, but the words are
yeah, but
important. They're
and if you
resolutely
interpret
agnostic.
us to have made the claim that one or the other accounts for the whole story, you have misunderstood us, right? We just don't know. And for that, he's been burnt as a witch, figuratively speaking, but reputationally, it has been the case, repeatedly for a quarter of a century. I just find that to be, obviously there are many other cases of people touching far less radioactive topics, where now, we're seeing the cancellation of people. And so I perceived, in hindsight, to be a kind of canary in the coal mine. And so anyway, I had him on my podcast, and that proved to be every bit as controversial as I had reason to fear it would be. I mean, I did.
After what book? Excuse me again for interrupting. After what
it
book?
It wasn't
did you
actually
have
in
him on
reference
your
to a book. I don't know when he had published his last book. I think the book before had been Coming Apart.
Yeah. Okay. It
right,
was before Human Diversity,
and
is really when I'm.
And so I did pay quite a reputational price for even having that conversation with him and giving him as much, aid and comfort as I did in that podcast. But I viewed it as as morally important to do, because it just seemed insane what was happening at that point around him and around everyone. I mean, J.K. Rowling and anyone else who's getting pilloried for having said something deemed blasphemous.
Murray is a special case. I actually teach the Murray case in my course on free inquiry in the modern world at Brown, where I'm, resolutely not agnostic about the issue of whether or not you should be able to investigate such questions. Of course you should. What are we doing, putting our heads in the sand? What are we doing to science, which is the foundation of our civilization, if we it's a kind of corruption of our intellectual life to foreclose the discussion of important questions based on evidence. Mary doesn't have to be right or wrong about that, but clearly the question doesn't answer itself. It's not a priori obvious what the answer to the question is. Question being, to what extent does biogenetic inheritance influence the expression of intellectual ability as measured by cognitive ability tests in modern society? That's a hard question. It's an important question. You get to ask that question. That's not a moral question. That's a question of cause and effect, and so on. And what manner of society will we have become if not only asking the question is forbidden, but defending the asking of the question is forbidden? I mean, like right here, right now, I'm Black. Everybody expects me to give a certain speech, and I'm not giving that speech. That speech is Charles Murray, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, is a white supremacist. That speech is that the line from Charles Murray to Jared Taylor is a short, straight line. Jared Taylor being American Renaissance guy, and he's a white supremacist. And, Jared Taylor is Jared Taylor. He gets to have his views too. I don't have to agree with them for him to be able to have his views too, but that's a separate question. Charles Murray, Losing Ground, was probably the most important book about social policy written in the second half of the 20th century. It was published in 1984. It was Murray's first big book. And it shaped the discussion about welfare policy to a very significant extent, especially on the right, but also in the center left. The Welfare Reform Acts of 1996 that Bill Clinton signed into law were substantially influenced by the work of Charles Murray and that critical assessment of the impact of the Great Society, social policy on inequality in America. That's the author of Losing Ground. Coming Apart is a very, very prescient. Robert Putnam, the very esteemed and distinguished Harvard political scientist, basically is following in his book, Our Kids, is basically following in Charles Murray's footsteps, pointing out that there's an opioid epidemic coming and there are deaths of despair right around the corner, and we had better pay attention to the separation and quality of life between class straight amongst white people in this country, or else we're going to miss the boat. Donald Trump became president in part because of the forces that Charles Murray was putting his finger on and Coming Apart. You're going to relegate him to the margins because he dared to ask a question about intelligence and class structure in American life, of which only one small part of the big compendium had to do with race, and now he's a racist and he's a white supremacist. You know nothing, anti-intellectual thugs. I mean, the people who want to shut up a discussion about this question and who want to make it a sign of your decency and your legitimacy for membership in society to castigate and ostracize Charles Murray, which I am not going to do. Those people are a threat to civilization, in my opinion.
Yeah, although there is one aspect of this which I'm a little conflicted about, because I don't know where to draw the line here. I mean, I don't even know where to draw the line with respect to Murray. I don't know well. I mean, my only conversation with him, I believe, was on that podcast, and I certainly don't think he's a racist. But I do question why he has given so much attention to this issue. Right. This is the one question I asked him in my podcast, which I felt like I didn't get a satisfactory answer to. It's like, why go there, or why go there this much, right? And I could imagine.
Let me ask you a question, Sam. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. I just want to know why he has to have an answer to that question. Why an investigator has to justify to anybody why they're investigating something, because that's ad hominem. When you ask him why, it's as if you suspect that his motives are somehow impure. And his motives have nothing to do with the validity of his statements about the question. You may say that you're not interested in the question, but whether or not why he's interested, I don't understand how that's
you can make a larger argument here, and you need to make a larger argument, or at least assume you're on the right side of this argument when thinking through the social consequences, or just the sheer consequences of finding out certain facts. Right. So I think there's certain forms of knowledge that are in fact dangerous and are best not sought. Right. Or certainly best, and if sought, best not published widely. And I mean, so one case, our most recent podcast is actually on this topic. It's the topic about which I've had my mind fundamentally change. You know, it used to be that I believed, and up until a couple of weeks ago, that so-called virus hunting was an intrinsically good thing, right? You send the virologists out into various caves and you get them to sample the viromes of the assembled bats, and then you, by doing this, discover new pathogens that may pose pandemic risk. And it seems like it's a good thing to, just by assumption, it seems like a good thing to know in advance what might be coming for us and to be able to prepare ourselves better for it. But in light of current technology, it seems like a patently insane thing to do. First of all, it's patently insane to then publish the genomes of these pathogens online, open source this project to the world, because what you're then doing is you're putting it,
because of bioterrorism.
Fully at this point, some tens of thousands, probably 30,000 at this moment, and the number is only increasing. You're putting into the minds of 30,000 people who are competent to build these pathogens, to just synthesize them on their own, effectively at home, right? So you're putting a lot of store in the mental health of 30,000 biochemists and molecular biologists and the people who have relevant training, knowing that fully 1% of these people are very likely to be insane. Right, or and probably another 1% are sufficiently open to being captured by some kind of ideology that would put them somewhere on the spectrum of being a concern there. Why do any of this work? But I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. Go for it.
I want to ask you a question about. I want to ask you a question about the virology thing. Are you saying don't sequence the genome, or are you saying keep that information closely held?
Don't even do the work, because now we know we can create vaccines in 24 hours once we get a genome, right? So, like at most, you're saving yourself 24 hours, 23 hours in being able to do this, having sequenced this in advance, right? It just doesn't make any sense operationally to. You're not getting ahead of anything, really, when you do this, and you're
for that application of the sequencing, you're not getting ahead of anything. For the vaccine development application of the sequencing, But how? I mean, this is my problem with trying to regulate this kind of activity at all. It presupposes a state of knowledge which doesn't exist in the absence of actually carrying out the investigation. You're going to regulate whether or not to do an investigation, the fruit of which might be massively developmentally helpful
yeah,
to humanity, as well as admitting of the
no,
risk that
I
you
think that argument
identify.
has disappeared.
But you can't know that
Well,
without
no.
actually
I mean,
having
at
done
this
the
point,
investigation.
on this particular topic,
How
I
so?
think we
Oh,
we
with COVID.
know that the risk is very high to publish this information, and the upside is very low, if non-existent, right? So,
Okay.
again, absent some other argument, I guess I could be swayed back in the other direction. I'm sure by a further argument about all of the benefits that would accrue to knowing this stuff in advance. Well, let's just assume.
Which I'm
So
not
let's just assume, for
competent to
argument's sake,
provide.
that doesn't exist in this case, right? So we have a clear case of there's massive downside to publishing certain facts widely, or even seeking those facts in the first place, and there's very little upside. Um, I wonder whether, in the case of doing a deep dive on intellectual differences between various groups, we're on similar ground here. Like, why seek this knowledge? What are we going to do with the knowledge, and why seek it? Now, I agree that we may be ambushed by this knowledge anyway. But
Okay, let me
go
interrupt
for it.
again. Let me interrupt again, Seth. Excuse me. No, no. I mean, the primary question is not about groups. The primary
Mhm.
question is about individuals. The group question, it seems to me, only to be a derivative or a second order question that arises once you've undertaken the primary investigations, which is understanding the foundations of human intelligence and its distribution in populations. So I don't know how you police the investigation of the uh, determinants of human intelligence so as to avoid the politically disquieting group comparative undertaking. I mean, it just seems, I mean, and that's precisely my problem with this kind of uh, moral management of scientific inquiry. I mean, it presumes a
Well,
kind of
just do you
omniscience.
think it might be possible that it would be better if we didn't have group level data on all of these differences, and we just had individual data, right? So, like, no one ever, we never took an inventory of what race you were or ethnic background you were, and we still, obviously, you every individual had to jump through all these hoops academically to get wherever they get. But at the end of the day, we weren't in a position to say, oh, we just looked at the MCAS scores for blacks and Asians, and it turns out that there's a
Yeah.
vast gulf between them. What do you want to do with that factoid?
Well, I know what Charles Murray's answer to your question is, and I think it would be mine as well. Sure, we can do that as long as you promise that we don't have a politics driven by the inequality and the representation of
Mm.
groups in these various activities. I tell you what, you give up your racial justice weapon, where whenever the number of doctors who are black is low, or the number of people who are promoted to partner at a law firm is low who are black, or the number of people who get into the Bronx High School of Science is low. You give that up and you stop collecting those statistics. And I'm happy to do away with investigating group disparity in the uh, determinants of human behavior that actually influence whether or not people excel at these activities. It seems to me you
Yeah, so
can't do
yeah, I
one
mean,
without
that's,
the other.
again, I'm open to argument on this point, but the world I think I want to live in is where race and other differences between groups has the moral and political status of hair color currently. Right? So we just simply don't have the data on how many blondes got into Harvard last year, and nor would anyone think to have that data. Right? We don't want the data. Nobody cares. How do we get there with respect to skin color and religion and anything else? Right? That's where I think I would want to be, and that, I mean, the path open to us there is to cease to pay attention to these variables.
Yeah, but yeah, and I agree. I mean, I guess I would have to, given
I mean,
what's going
if I
on so
told you we were
far.
going to, There was a
Though
group of people who wanted to add hair color to the list of concerns, differentiating groups, right? If there was a big political movement around how many, let's find out how many redheads are currently employed at Fortune 500 companies. Yeah.
hair color,
And
eye
we're
color,
now
yeah.
really we've convinced ourselves that we now need to care about these variables too, right? That would seem like a perverse misuse of moral intelligence, right? And it just why add that to
Well,
our,
it, it could be coming. I mean, people, body size, obesity, uh, the cultural preference for certain kinds of ideal types. So the beautiful woman is the woman who's got blue eyes and blonde hair and whatnot. If we looked into the market for eggs, human eggs that people are going to do in vitro fertilization and whatnot are purchasing, I don't know this for a fact, but I bet a lot that there's a premium driven by these kinds of characteristics, like how tall was the woman, was she blonde or brunette, was she white or black or Asian, were her eyes blue or brown or whatever. I'll bet people actually pay a premium in that market for certain traits, and so an investigator might want to know whether or not employment or success in the business world or number of people come out to your movie or whatever turns on that, and then they might end up wanting to collect that data.
I think we're right to have an intuition that more of that sort of thing would be regressive. Yeah. And so,
Isn't
so
that
then why not set our sights on less and less and less and finally none at all? So that, because it would seem insane to ask the question, wait a minute, just how many blondes did get into Harvard last year? Right? Like just that, I mean, like who are you that you could possibly care? Right? Like who's going to get out of bed tomorrow morning with that moral and political project? Right? How do we get there with respect to race? That's the riddle I think we need to solve. But the first impediment to solving that riddle are all the people who think it would be um, it's just politically inadmissible to even have that as a goal, right? They don't even aspire to get to some kind of race blind utopia, right? They're like it's not even, that wouldn't even be utopia. That would be a bad outcome on their account. And the people who feel this way are, on the far right, real racists, real white supremacists who say that, the moral differences and political differences between people are in fact indelible and are right to be drawn at the skin. And the people on the far left, the far left identitarians who think that it really matters what race you are. I mean, these people have to either be convinced or overruled, right and left, and that's a massive political project.
Let me see if I can imagine what they're thinking, because I agree with you that we should be in a world where these things are given less credence. They're thinking about history. First of all, they suspect the person who invites this move. They think you're trying to change the subject. They want justice. They think that the racial disparities to which they will attend by doing the kind of bean counting that you and I might wish they wouldn't do, those disparities are a reflection of structures of domination and devaluation and whatnot. And they want justice. And they think that your effort to call the whole thing off, we had race for a few centuries as the West came out of Europe and conquered the world. We had race as we did a colonial thing and a slavery thing and whatnot. We had race. And now we get to the 21st century, we want to call the whole thing off. And they're saying, no, not so quick. My bean counting is really in the service of a larger accountancy, a moral accountancy, which can't even be broached, let alone resolved without attention to the things you're telling me
Well,
to
that might be
disattend.
true in certain cases. I mean, that's why I consider myself confused around questions of affirmative action, right? Like, where are the places in our society where affirmative action still makes a lot of sense and is in fact necessary, and where are the places where it's obviously counterproductive? I mean, the devil is in the details there, and I'm open to argument in any specific case, and there's certainly places in our society where I think we're right to worry that something like structural racism is in fact true and problematic, and it needs to be dismantled. And then there are cases where we've obviously flipped it, and there's a structural racism that's working to the advantage of Black and brown people and to the disadvantage of Asians, certainly, and whites. And um, this may be a controversial claim, it may be a blasphemous one, but I think it's probably true, certainly approximately true at this moment, that any truly desirable high status place in American culture now is more easily gotten to for um, people, Black and brown people, provided the equivalent uh, uh, qualifications, which is to say that if you are getting great grades and you have great test scores and you're Black, there is no door barred to you in this society, and in fact, every door is wide open to you. Every door that you would want to go through. You take the top 20% of any corner of culture, whether it's journalism, academia, science, media, Hollywood, but just any place that you'd want to be, where high status would accrue to you for being there. It is easier, not harder, if you're Black at this moment. I would make that claim, and maybe there's some exception somewhere, but it's not. It's not at the Oscars. It's not in a writer's room in comedy in Hollywood. It's not. It's certainly not at Princeton. And so
I got it.
Where is it?
No, it's not. It's not at a law firm. And it's not in medical school.
Right.
It's not when you're running for office, et cetera. So no, don't worry. I'm not the least bit offended, although I can imagine a lot of people will be offended. It sounds like that's not the first time you've made that declaration, though, Sam. I mean, it was,
but it's so. But what do we do with that? Like, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, right? What I'm saying is lying about that is a bad thing. Driving people crazy with those lies is a bad thing.
Well, we tell the truth. What we do is we tell the truth. I want to say one final thing about affirmative action. Then I want to talk to you about God for a little bit. It's undignified for Black people to be reliant upon special dispensation in order to be included into the most valued venues in society as a permanent way of doing business going forward. That's not equality. That's being a ward. That's being a client. You're being taken care of. You're being covered for. I don't know how anybody with self-respect could be happy living in such a world. I think the corruption of the soul here, attendant to accepting special dispensation as if it were your right because of something that happened, not to you, not even to your parents, something that happened to your ancestors long since gone. You buy into a narrative of permanent injury, and then you walk around with your hand out expecting to be treated specially, afforded a special privilege as an entitlement, and you call that equality. That's not equality. So quite apart from, I think, the legitimate concerns that you raise about the dilemma of what brain surgeon to choose, or about the fact of favorable, not disfavorable discrimination is the norm in many venues of American society. There's something profoundly wrongheaded for Black people here about settling.
Well, what about using race as a tiebreaker in cases of equally qualified people? Assuming diversity is intrinsically
okay,
good, or that it's sane for an institution like Harvard to want as much of a representation of American society as they can get whilst keeping their standards high. Why not use race as a tiebreaker?
I think that's an easy case to which I can say yes, but I don't think it's very helpful because that happens almost never. I mean, tiebreaker is an event of equal qualification, event of measure zero is the way the technicians would put it. Smooth distributions. I'm drawing at random. I've got two people. What's the likelihood that they're going to come out exactly the same? Right. That's a low probability event. But it's fine as far as it goes. I mean, I'm not talking about administrative practice or how to admit kids to college. I'm talking about politics. I'm talking about the large narrative of what is racial justice and what is equality. And I'm saying, I think, and this is just my view, I've developed it in some of my own writing. Development
Mm.
is the key. Performance is the key. Ability, mastery is the key. Preference, it's so 1970s. You know, I say the world is fast moving and it's changing. The Chinese are coming. Uh, Nothing is standing still. But Black people don't want to be in the position of being wards of uh, uh, pitying liberal establishment who think they are virtue signaling and standing on the right side of history by looking at other way at our mediocrity. We want to be players, real
Mm.
players. We want to be like the
Well,
Jews.
actually, there's another point here, another
What's wrong with
moral
that?
paradox or apparent paradox, which I'm sure this is probably a point you've made before. I think I heard Coleman make it the first time I heard this. Uh, but yeah,
Coleman Hughes.
who, despite his age, I have learned a lot from him. Talk about a precocious young man. But yeah,
He's a brilliant kid, no doubt. As you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
I understand you're a big booster
But
of
so
his.
he made the point that if affirmative action is good and it's and then morally necessary, why do we have to treat it as a as something that is ignominious when actually pointed out, right? Why couldn't they? Why wouldn't we point to the students on our campuses who are affirmative action admittances and celebrate them as the test cases that are correcting this moral wrong, right? It's obvious. It's obvious that that it just
Indeed.
doesn't run through to do that because no one, as you say, wants to be someone who got into their station for reasons other than their merits, right? And that's and obviously we don't have a yeah. Go ahead.
Actually, no, I was to say, ironically, it's actually, I think, worse than that in a way. No one wants to be, you got to Yale Law School because of affirmative action. On the other hand, having gotten to Yale Law School, graduated, and risen to the federal bench, you might be heard to say, I'm a beneficiary of affirmative action and
Mm-hmm.
I'm proud of it.
Okay.
So people don't want anyone else to point out that they are
But then you
beneficiaries
can
of
own it.
affirmative
Yeah.
action. But then in defense of affirmative action, are quite prepared to crow about having been boosted by affirmative. So the discourse is just entirely dishonest around these
Sure.
issues. I
Sure.
think. Can we talk about God for a minute? Is
Well,
belief
depends
in
what
God
you mean by
irrational?
God. I mean, there's something you could mean by that, which I think is entirely rational. But if you're talking about a personal God, a sectarian God, the God of Abraham as opposed to some other God, and maybe some specific uh, construal of the God of Abraham, and anything else is anathema and likely to send a person to hell. I mean, once you start adding layers of doctrine onto the claim, then I think it becomes irrational and untenable. And I think we've lost the right to our provincialism on that front. I just think we know too much about the world. We know too much about how these books came into our possession. We know too much about the merely human origin of the texts that tell us that every word between these covers is inerrant for all time and cannot be edited by human hand. And uh, we know that we have just too many of these books, each claiming to be the sole word of the creator of the universe. And so, therefore, I mean, this is the point that Bertrand Russell made um, to comic effect. That just by the sheer numbers of religions that claim to be the sole truth, that
No one of them could be.
every believer, even if you are a believer, you have to expect damnation purely on probabilistic grounds. I mean, there's more than five of these things, and each claims that everyone else is going to hell.
What does your thin God you say a specific tradition which makes very strong claims like Christianity or Judaism or Islam. Uh, you don't want to take these texts as infallible or whatever. So that notion of God you would reject on grounds of rationality. But what would the thin version of God that you might think acceptable to a rational contemporary person look like?
Uh, well, so if you want to say, as I would, that uh, consciousness, that in you which is that makes your being in this world something to consider in the first place, right? The thing that adds value to anything, right? The experiential part of the cosmos that is resident in you at this moment, right? Um, this is something we don't understand. Obviously we haven't explained this yet. We don't know how it's arising and therefore integrated in the physics of things. We don't even in the end we don't even know that it is arising on the basis of the physics of things. That's not something we can say about the mind, but I think that is something we can still say about consciousness. So consciousness is a mystery and a miracle, and it's the most important thing, right? And I'm not saying, as a matter of science, we shouldn't seek to explain it, but I think there's good reason to wonder whether we will ever explain it, and there's certainly good reason to think that any explanation will in fact not be deflationary, right? I mean, even if we perfectly explain consciousness in the end, we understand exactly how it's arising on the basis of information processing in complex systems like brains, say, and we know what the necessary and sufficient conditions of it are, it is still the thing that matters, right? It is still the source of all beauty and all moral goodness and all apprehensions of truth. And it can be explored on its own side. It can only be explored on its own side experientially, in contemplation, in meditation, with psychedelics. I mean, like the good stuff of life is on the first person side, right? Even if, yeah.
Hold on a minute. I just want
Sure.
to. I don't want to get lost here. What is consciousness now?
Well,
I mean, literally, is it self awareness? When does the
It,
complex
it's the
system,
fact that the
which
lights
is
are
our
on at all,
brain,
right? So self awareness is an added capacity within consciousness, but it's the fact that there's something that is like to be you in this moment. It's the fact that it's the fact that the lights are on, that there's a qualitative character to experience, and there's not, it need not have been the case, right? Given what we think we know at this moment about the brain, it seems that not every aspect of our minds have this character, right? That the brain is doing a lot that does not seem to be uh, experienced consciously by any part of the mind. Right now, this is,
for example, it's regulation of our breathing
yeah,
and the
and
beating
even
of our
stuff that is
heart. Go on.
closer to what we can consciously apprehend in each moment. I mean, so for instance, I'm speaking now. I can't consciously inspect how I'm following the rules of English grammar insofar as I'm able to do that. And I can't consciously inspect my failures to do that. I'm just witnessing this product of unconscious information processing. I don't know how I get to the end of the sentence, right?
But
And
that,
when I fail to get to the end of the sentence, as I occasionally do,
but that you have a sense
yeah,
of you. Excuse me again. You're speaking, but you're not, as it were, aware of exactly how it is that your brain is causing you to speak, but you're doing it nonetheless. But there's a you who is aware of the fact that this is happening somehow, and that's the mysterious dimension of being. The lights are on that you're referring
yeah,
to.
but I
Again, this is
wouldn't
a
put
question.
it. I wouldn't. A lot turns on what you mean by you there, because I do think the self, as it is generally perceived, is an illusion, right? And I think self transcendence is the actual core of of our religious concerns, right? It's the experiential core. It's what made Jesus Jesus, right? If Jesus, I don't know, I don't know who the historical Jesus actually was, but assuming he existed more or less as described in the Bible, and the same with Buddha and any other matriarch or patriarch of our great religions. The the aspect of human experience that they were testifying to that made them interesting enough to gather around and form religions upon relates to qualities like self-transcendence and unconditional love. And they have the far end of the distribution of positive human psychology, which is all too rarely experienced by us, but still experienced by millions and millions of people, if only in moments. And there are ways to experience it more and more, right? And this is the valid ground of our spiritual concern, right? Personally and collectively and intellectually, right? I think we should want to understand this scientifically, but personally, I think we should all want to experience more and more of this good stuff before we die, right? I mean, what is the point of life? What is the point of having more years on this earth together? Like, what is the if you die today, what is the missed opportunity of tomorrow? It's all of this.
And you propose that the answer to that question
The
is
experience of
experience?
love and self-transcendence and the depth of your being in, the cosmos is illuminated where you stand, right? It is what it's like to be you and what it's potentially like to be you when you really get your head screwed on straight, right? When you're no longer.
You think self-transcendence is an
No,
illusion? I
self-transcendence
really
is
am trying to
real. The self
understand.
that is transcended is an illusion. Yeah, I mean, the self is generally
Ah,
the cramped self
ah.
of otherwise known as the ego, right? The the petty self, the fearful self, the self that feels confined in each and reducible to in each moment the stream of discursive thought, right? That the voice in your head that feels like you in each moment. That is what is to be penetrated by uh, any valid form of spiritual inquiry, right? I mean, when you're talking about, and this is back to your question about God and the validity of religion. The baby in the bathwater that we should not want to throw out is this range of positive human experience that is what it is the experiential fact around which every religion has crystallized, right? It's why we have religion in the first place. The reason why you have a Jesus, right, who was so charismatic as to get people to make, vast sacrifices to live by the lights of his message. And the way you have for thousands of years, uh, some number of Christian contemplatives who've had deep experience trying to be more and more like Jesus. The way you have a Meister Eckhart say is that it is possible to have fundamental insights into the nature of your mind that are transformative. That it's possible to be very different than you were yesterday based on something you can do with your attention. Right? It's possible to not suffer the way you used to suffer over ridiculous things. Right? It's possible for you not to feel divided from the world and
Okay.
from nature and from other people in the way that you tend to feel divided when you're just lost in self-directed self-talk. And so I think all of that is valid and more than valid. I think that's the most important project in life. And it is traditionally it has only been given a religious framing. I just think we at this point in our history, and for probably 100 years this has been true, we have to recognize that what is being testified to there is not the unique divinity of any one God or the unique veracity of any one religious tradition as organized by specific literature. It's that there is a universal there are universal facts about the human mind that need to be understood in general, universalizable, non-sectarian terms, very much in the terms of 21st century science. But again, the 21st century science that explores this can't discount the first person side of these questions, because it's the answer at the back of the book of nature is not going to be, you're just a bag of chemicals, and love is just a certain complement of neurotransmitters.
Okay.
There is an experiential side to this.
Clearly, I'm in your wheelhouse here.
Yep.
And our time is limited.
Always.
Maybe we can have another conversation. I don't know, Sam. Would you be willing to have another conversation? I'd really like to. Here I am, a lapsed Christian who was baptized at the age of 40, who was deeply immersed in an African American, charismatic, uh, fundamentalist congregation. I mean, not cultish, but uh, very traditionally religious. And and I have thrown all that over, but I still found meaning in the prayer, the ritual, the community, uh, the practices of that faith. That meaning felt very real to me, and it was outside of myself. It wasn't just experiential. It wasn't only about my mind. It was somehow being a part of the flow, being integrated into a web of mutually believing people. There was a community. There was something, as I say, meaningful there. And I don't see any room for that at all.
No,
in the
there's
vision that you
definitely
just
room, but you're asking to add to the baby in the bathwater the variable of community and organizing beliefs and ritual. And I would grant you that all of that is very powerful and for many people necessary. And I think we suffer a deficit of it in secular society, right? But I would argue that what we need are non-embarrassing, non-divisive, and therefore non-sectarian and non-dogmatic approaches to community building and ritual and awe and profundity. And I think we want all of the good stuff. We want beautiful buildings in which to gather for high purposes, right? Now, it just so happens that the only architecture currently devoted to that stuff at the moment is specifically denominational, right? The only people who could raise enough money to build a beautiful building in the middle of Manhattan are the religious dogmatists, are the Christians and Jews and Muslims who got those buildings built, right? So now if you're a secular group wanting to meet for purely rational, secular, but nevertheless ennobling reasons on a Sunday, you have to figure out which church you're going to rent. Otherwise, you're going to wind up in a bad hotel banquet room, right? It's just like, so the question is, what does a 21st century temple of wisdom look like? And who's going to build it, right? And what songs do you sing that aren't embarrassing in terms of their intellectual content, but then also aren't embarrassing for their, having been totally denuded of beauty because, bad secular writers got their hands on them, right? And, created bad songs, right? So it's a hard problem to solve culturally, and we haven't solved it. But I do think we have to recognize that sectarianism, real sectarianism in the 21st century doesn't make any intellectual or moral sense.
We're going to let that be the last word, and my Christian believing friends out there are going to be mad at me. But take comfort that part two is coming, just like they say on Easter Sunday. Good Friday was part one, Easter is part two. Part two in this conversation is coming. We'll arrange that, Sam. Thanks a lot, Sam Harris, extraordinary neuroscientist and philosopher and best-selling writer and podcaster who came on the Glenn Show.
Happy to do it. Thanks for all you do, Glenn.
Thanks, Sam.